Some of the subtler effects in the HitFilm 2 trailer are found in the establishing shots leading up to the UFO appearance. On first glance, there don't appear to be any effects, but in fact, all of the floating atmospheric chaff was created inside HitFilm. I'm Simon Jones from HitFilm.com, and in this tutorial I'll be taking a look at how to create this kind of subtle particle effect. What I'm not going to focus on in this tutorial is the motion tracking required in each of these specific shots. Instead, I'm just going to look at the creation of the particle effect, which you can then use in your own shots. Okay, so let's go from the start. Here we have an empty composite shot, and into this I'm going to drop a particle simulator layer, which you can find in the particles and simulation category. Okay, so we'll stick this on, and that's going to add a camera as well, because particle simulator is a 3D layer. Okay, and then we have some particles. As you can see, the particles start spawning at the start of the layer. We don't actually want that because we don't want our atmospheric stuff to be appearing mid-shot. We want it to just be there from the start. So one neat way to do that is if you go into the general settings, you'll find the time shift property. I'm going to put minus 10 seconds in here, and that means that the particles will actually start spawning 10 seconds before the start of the layer. So as you can see now, they're there right from the start. Okay, currently they're coming out of a single point. And that's because if we go into the emitter, you'll see that the shape is a point emitter. Okay, so what we want to do is actually change it to a cube shape. This means that rather than emitting from a single point, we now have particles coming out of an area. And if I just select the shape here, you can see that cube on the screen. I'm actually going to switch to the perspective view just so we can get a better scene of what's going on. So there you go, you've got this little rectangle with all these particles spawning out of it. We can now change the width, height and depth of this cube to affect where the particles are spawned. Now, how you want to do this will depend entirely on the particular shot you're doing. For the shots that I was working on in the trailer, where it's meant to be taking place in this large field with quite a bit of camera movement, I wanted quite a large area. And how you set this up will dramatically affect the appearance. So you can see here we've got a lot of depth. And based on where the camera is at the end of this cube, the more depth we have, the greater there'll be a sense of depth in the final shot. Whereas if you crush it right up, it will seem like a much smaller effect and it won't appear to be filling the whole space. The settings here will depend on the specifics of the shot that you're working on. Okay, so you can see all these particles spawning and disappearing, and that's not something we want. We want the particles to just be there the whole time. So what we're going to do is set it so that the particles stop spawning at the start of the video. And the quick and easy way to do this is to go into our particle system and then go into its general properties. And you have the active property. We're going to keyframe this, then move forward one frame and turn it off. That means that as soon as that first frame is hit, the particles stop spawning. But don't forget, because of the time shift, they've been spawning for 10 seconds. So we have 10 seconds worth of particles already there, and then as soon as the actual composite shot begins, they stop spawning, as you can see. Now, of course, we don't want them to disappear either. The reason they're doing this is because they've got a really short lifetime. And this can be changed going into the movement settings and changing the life. So 30 seconds, and now our particles are each lasting for 30 seconds, starting from 10 seconds before the start of the layer. Okay, so there we go. We have lots and lots of particles floating around. Okay, we're just going to increase the number of particles. So the density of the particle cloud is also going to vary depending on the particular effect you're going for. HitFilm can handle a fair few particles though, so don't be afraid to experiment and ramp up the quantity a little bit. Okay, next up, let's pick an actual texture. We're going to go for a built-in texture. This is actually the one I used in the trailer, the Aurora Borealis texture, which originally obviously was designed for doing aurora effects, but it just happens to look a little bit like kind of floaty bit of dust, which is ideal for what we're doing. Okay, so if we move around here, you can see we now have a textured particle system, but they're all kind of the same way around, all looking very, very similar. And we don't want that because each little bit of chaff should be a separate piece. You don't want it to look too computer generated. The way to do this is to go into the appearance variation controls and add some random variation. So starting off here, texture angle, this means that each particle can have a varied beginning angle. So you can see immediately everything looks far more varied, with each texture being at a different angle to the others. And even though we're still using a very limited number of textures, it immediately looks like there's more variety. Okay, in addition to this, there's another setting which is texture angle per second, and this determines what the texture does over time. So the texture angle determines the initial angle of the texture. Texture angle per second actually introduces some animation to the texture. So currently, you can see that they're all staying exactly on the same angle throughout their entire lives. Whereas if we increase the texture angle per second, they're going to start rotating at a particular speed. Okay, to make this easier to see, I'm just going to lower the speed down to 0 because we don't want the actual particles moving around too much. You can see they've all clumped together in that cube shape now. So we're actually going to drop down the size. So now that the particles aren't actually moving, you can see that they're all just staying completely in place. But if we increase the texture angle per second, we now get this subtle rotational movement in each of the particles, which looks much more like something is floating in the air. Okay, so this is starting to look a bit more like it does in the final shots. I'm just going to adjust the shape of our cube, because obviously now that we've slowed down the particles and made them smaller, we might want to adjust the cube shape a bit more as well. Okay, currently everything is still looking a bit too samey. Every single texture is exactly the same size, for example. So going into movement variation, increasing it to 30%, you can see that we now have different sized particles. Some of them large, some of them small. It looks far more realistic. You don't want every single bit of chaff to look exactly the same. So we're kind of there with our main effect. Let's switch back to the active camera to see what it looks like through the camera. Okay, if we move around you can see that we've got this really nice 3D depth effect going on, but everything's looking a little bit too dense and a bit too large. This currently looks kind of like a flock of seagulls exploded just off camera. So let's increase the size of the cube so that these particles spread out a little bit more realistically. We'll just really ramp up these values quite large. Okay, that's looking better. You can imagine now as the camera pushes through that this will look like a much more subtle atmospheric effect. But of course currently we just have white particles. You can see there we go, they're moving around nice and slowly, rotating slightly. What we need to do now is actually drop in a video layer so that we can start to composite it realistically. So I'm just going to select one of the shots from the trailer and we'll just drop that underneath. And suddenly it becomes very apparent that our particles are very, very white. And we don't want white particles because that looks weird. So what we could do is go into appearance and just simply change the color like this. I just picked a color off the ground and it looks immediately lots better. But as before, we now have every single texture being the same color. Now if we increase the variation of color, you certainly get variation, but in every single color, and we get this slightly crazy psychedelic kind of floating atmospheric haze, which we don't want. So instead, I'm going to go to the lifetime panel and use the color property here. Okay, so there's multiple ways you can use the lifetime color. I'm actually going to go into the type and choose random. What this does is you can then create a gradient and each particle will pick a color from that gradient at random. So let's put this tab over here and then we'll use the pipette to select a bright area of the ground. So one of these little highlights on the grass down here perhaps, round about there. Okay, so that looks good. But then we're going to make another tab and select a dark area. Okay, so now we have each particle is picking a color from somewhere on that gradient. So you can see we have light, we have dark particles, and it's all nicely varied, just like you'd get if this was a real atmospheric kind of effect. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. And you can see that that was actually a very simple process to get it to that level. All that's left now is to composite it into the scene. We need to do some camera tracking and maybe add some more layers on. But I'm going to get into that in a different tutorial, but hopefully this has given you the grounding you need to actually create the particle effect in the first place, and hopefully shows you that it's not difficult to create something that can still look very realistic. If we now just switch over to this other composite shot here, which has the finished shot from the trailer, you can see what it looks like once it's actually all rendered out. So as the camera pushes through this shot following the people on the bike, you can see that there's a really great sense of 3D depth. This shot was tracked in HitFilm, and then that camera data was just used so that the camera moves through the 3D particle simulator in the same way as the camera in the live action shot. You can see we've added on some extra stuff like the sun and the light rays and that kind of thing. As usual, the more you layer up your composite, the more realistic it's going to look. Here's another shot. You can see a slightly different angle, but we've just got the chaff going past. And if we look at it in perspective view, you can see the camera moving along, designed and animated to track with the camera in the live action shot. Very, very simple. Same particle effect just set up there. And this is the thing, once you've designed your particle effect, you can then reuse it multiple times in different shots. So here again, you can see the same general particle effect, just with a different camera move going through it. And this shows how versatile the particle simulator is, because it's a fully procedural, fully 3D effect. It can be used in multiple shots without requiring a ton of extra setup each time. So there you have it, a surprisingly quick and easy technique for creating atmospheric stuff. We used this for chaff, but you could use exactly the same effect with a few minor tweaks for, say, post-apocalyptic ash falling from the sky, or the aftermath of an explosion, or pollen, or maybe dust and flakes of skin from the sun-blasted crew of a spaceship sent to restart our star by dropping a nuclear bomb into its core. That film really is underrated. Anyway, you get the idea. As always, thanks for watching. We'll be back soon with more tutorials and other exciting developments.